Emotional reconnections after extraordinary encounters. Brand new Saved by a Stranger tonight on BBC Two at 9. Now, Politics Live with Joe Coburn.
It's Thursday, it's 12:15 and we're live in Westminster. Joining me today, Conservative MP Tom Hunt, Labour MP Florence Pugh, academic and author Professor Sarah Churchwell, and former Boris Johnson advisor Gitto Harry. Today,
I'm essentially a fed-up commuter who became Transport Secretary.
Will Great British Railways make British Rail great again?
We're getting there.
A report seen by the BBC says test and trace failures are partly responsible for a surge in the Indian variant in one of the worst affected areas. We'll bring you the details.
The civil servants join the same clubs, enjoy the same kind of literary jokes, and speak the same private language.
Why is the civil service still as middle class as it was over 50 years ago? And what can Joe teach Keir about winning from the left? Let's start with the story you heard in the headlines there by showing you this headline in the Daily Mail and how they're reporting it. British Rail is back. Almost. Biggest shake-up of train network for 3 decades will see complex franchise system axed and fares get cheaper. So, yes, this is the news. The government is calling a radical shake-up of the railways, forming a new state-owned body called Great British Railways to set timetables and prices, sell tickets in England and manage rail infrastructure. But private operators will still be contracted to run most trains. So my question to all of you, starting with Tom, is should the government just go all the way and completely renationalise the railways?
No, I don't think it should. I do think this is to be welcomed, though. I mean, I think that the system has been far too fragmented. And as an MP who often raises concerns from constituents, I feel like I'm passed from pillar to post. It's Network Rail say it's a train operating company, the train operating company say it's Network Rail. There's been a lack of accountability. This would bring much more accountability and therefore I believe a better service for my constituents, and particularly if we can get cheaper rail fares, because the Ipswich to London line is one of the most expensive per mile in the country. Right, and Florence, what about you? I'm sure you hear from lots of constituents about problems with the railways, but should the government just renationalise the whole thing?
I think obviously we welcome more public control over our railways, and this is something that Labour's long argued for in terms of public ownership will provide better value for taxpayers, for passengers, and I think the government have to be honest to say that rail privatisation has failed. But what we really need to see for hard-working commuters who will, we want them back on the railways, back to work, is around the flexible ticketing promises. That is what will really make it cheaper. So I'm quite concerned. I don't know if people listened to Grant Shapps on Radio 4 this morning. There isn't any information around future ticket prices, and he couldn't guarantee or rule out future prices wouldn't be above inflation. And most importantly, we've got to look at the fact that there is nothing in this report around the decarbonisation of our railway network. That has to be central to our transport system. So cutting railway service won't help, but instead of reducing, we need to look at how we reduce passenger numbers, but making sure we've got an ambitious railway network that hits all those targets and one that's clean and affordable for everyone.
So, Florence, is that a fully nationalised railway service, yes or no?
Ministers have now acknowledged that rail privatisation hasn't worked.
Right. So, yes, I'm presuming. Gitto, what about you? I don't know what memories you may or may not have of British Rail, but should it be fully renationalised?
Very little boy, obviously. The idea with this is you get the best of both worlds. You get the accountability, you get the scrutiny, you get somebody to blame in the public sector, and that has to be right. There has to be political accountability there. But you don't lose the innovation, hopefully, the efficiency, the drive, the kind of hunger, if you like, of the private sector at its best. So hopefully, if they get this right, and there is a precedent for the Prime Minister himself, he did, little known fact, collapse a public-private partnership when he was Mayor of London, brought something that had been largely private back in-house, And the combination of that scrutiny, while still using private companies, did improve the transport system here in London at the time. And he's obviously hoping he can pull off the same across the UK now.
Sarah, what's your view? Fully nationalised or not?
Look, I haven't been convinced that nationalising much of anything works particularly well. So I do think that a flexible system, if one can be creative, will be the best option. But, you know, as somebody who uses the trains all the time, to me, it's really simple. It does need accountability. That's absolutely right. And if this provides that, then that will be an important step in the right direction. But we all know that the cost for value is an absolute scandal compared with any other comparable country. And this doesn't say anything about fares. It's absolutely right that it doesn't say anything about making it greener. It doesn't say anything about actually creating a better service that's more affordable. And until we actually get investment and protect against the kind of extractive economy that we have right now, then I think it's not going to go far enough. But maybe it's a step in the right direction.
All right, well, let's talk about a breaking story being brought to us by the BBC's political editor, Laura Kunsberg. You again heard in the headlines it is to do with failures in test and trace. Laura, what have you discovered?
Hi, Joe. Hello, everyone. Well, this is a really interesting story because for the last couple of weeks, when people have watched cases go up in some areas because of the so-called Indian variant, they've been looking for reasons. Why? Was it to do with the fact that the government acted slowly in putting India on the red list, banning most travel from coming into the UK? Or was it because in some pockets of the country there's been less take-up of the vaccine? But a story that came our way has revealed one of the other reasons that some health officials believe is behind this surge. A report that we've seen here suggests that the national test and trace system for 3 weeks didn't give 8 local authorities across England full details of positive cases in their area. And the important consequence of that was it meant local health teams on the ground weren't then able to go around finding out where those people were, working out who they'd been in contact with, and really making sure that they were trying to manage the spread of the disease in their area. And one of the councils, it seems by bad luck, that ended up being without that vital information was Blackburn with Darwin, which I'm sure our viewers know by now, is one of the parts of the country that really is having to grapple with a surge in coronavirus, one of those parts of the country where surge vaccination is being put in place. And it seems, according to the report that we've seen, that failures in the national test and trace system were one of the reasons behind this, which for many people has been a really worrying situation. And it's put in doubt, of course, the progress of the unlocking, you know, that date on June the 21st, when, in theory, everything's meant to be getting back to normal.
Right. Well, what about the data Boris Johnson has said we are going to get on the transmissibility? We're waiting for that, probably perhaps tomorrow, perhaps at the beginning of next week. What's the government actually saying, though, in response to this report and the failures in test and trace?
So we've asked the Department of Health about this, as you would expect, to try to get to the bottom of exactly what has happened. What they've said to us is that a small amount of information was not passed on as quickly as it should have been. As I understand it, there was some kind of technical glitch. It's even been suggested to me that there was a systems upgrade that meant that the national database wasn't functioning in the way that it should. The details and the fuller context of exactly what went wrong is not something that's forthcoming at this stage. But the Department of Health officially have acknowledged that something went wrong here. The government's not trying to deny that this actually happened. But what we're not sure of is the true scale. So what we know is that nearly 800 cases were not reported to local authorities because of this. Nearly 300 of them were in Blackburn with Darwin, that real hotspot now. But what might be interesting to know, Joe, is, we haven't had much chatter recently about test and trace. Our viewers will remember that over the year, there have been real moments where there's been a lot of criticism of test and trace, a lot of very strong defence of it from the government. It's a system that didn't used to exist. Now it's tested and traced more than 10 million people. That's no mean feat. But it may well be that other issues that have been going on with test and trace emerge because of this report. I think we'll just have to wait and see, but it will be really interesting to see what else we can find out through the course of today and whether or not the Department of Health wants to give us any information. We know they told local councils about what was going wrong on the 11th of May, pretty much 3 weeks since the glitch actually first happened. What we don't know, and what the Department of Health won't tell me yet, is when they first knew of the problem. And that is a pretty crucial piece of information. If they did know earlier on, why didn't they tell local councils about the problem? If they didn't know, Well, that's potentially worrying too, because if there was a real flaw in the system and nobody was aware of it, well, how many other times have things gone wrong? But we should say officially the Department of Health says test and trace has, been an extraordinary achievement. They've tested more than 10 million people, but they're not denying that something went wrong here, but they're not giving us the full details of exactly quite what.
Laura Kunsberg there, thank you very much. Well, Tom, listening to all of that, failures of test and trace, the political implications could be huge, couldn't they?
Well, I think what's quite clear at the moment is there are a couple of huge schemes the government are managing, almost at a wartime level of organisation and logistical organisation required, both in terms of a national vaccination programme, which has been a great success, which actually put us in a pretty much a better position than almost any of the European countries. And in terms of test and trace is also of a similar scale to a vaccination programme. Both very complex, complicated, nationally organised schemes. And if there is an issue here, clearly it's important it's bottom out and we get those answers. But ultimately, what's also important is what we know about this variant. And yes, it is of concern. But we've also found out today that it might not be as transmissible as first feared, and also that it doesn't seem to be the case that if you've been fully vaccinated, this poses a serious threat to your health. So I think those two are key things as well. But clearly, this needs to be bottomed out. And the government are acknowledging there's an issue that needs to be looked into.
Right, but it has been more than a year, hasn't it, to sort out the problems, the teething problems, as the government would have said, about test and trace. Here we have a real-life consequence of not passing on information when the Indian variant had been seeded here and then was spreading through the community. We still don't yet know the levels of transmissibility. Do you accept that the government must take responsibility for the fact that they may have contributed, the test and trace scheme may have contributed to the spread of that Indian variant?
I think if there's been an area of test and trace, I think the government will be open and honest about that. But I think we also need to be appreciative of the scale of what is going on at the moment, both in terms of a national vaccination programme, but also test and trace. And I think, by and large, I think the government has done very well over the last few months. If there's a problem here with test and trace, I'm not denying. Clearly, that needs to be dealt with, and we need to get the answers. But I just think we need to...
Should India have been put on the red list earlier?
Well, I think Bangladesh and Pakistan were on the red list, and I think at the time when they were put on the red list, they had higher levels than India. But ultimately, what I'm seeing right now is a government that is absolutely determined to find out everything about this variant and how it's impacting the population. And from what I can see, it's all over it.
Florence?
It's quite worrying to hear that report, and this goes back to some of the issues that we were raising, that Labour were raising at the beginning, around the privatisation of some parts of what the government were doing. You have to have a mixture of both private and public. And locally in my borough in Lambeth, where we've had 2 surge testings on the back of the South African variant, where the local council, the CCG, our community partners were in charge of that. It works. It works when you trust local people to carry out some of that vital work. The vaccination rollout has worked because, again, it's been led by our hospitals, our pharmacies, our GPs. Locally, it works. So the government needs to trust the public sector a lot more, instead of wasting so much money on some of these private test and tracing.
OK, Tom?
What I'm concerned about is that I hope this hasn't ultimately cost lives.
Tom?
Well, I think something which isn't acknowledged there is the huge success of the vaccination programme is also because of a judgment call made by our Prime Minister. The decision not to go with EMA, which I'm sure that the Leader of Opposition would have gone down that road, and I think that would have cost life. The decision not to have
Are you talking about the European Medicines Agency?
Yes.
If you're using
ultimately, it was a judgment call made by our Prime Minister to do our own thing on vaccine procurement that has saved huge numbers of lives in this country, and I think the Prime Minister deserves a lot of credit for that.
Do you accept that, Florence?
The Prime Minister deserves credit for working with the NHS to roll out the vaccine, including local mosque, which I went to 2 weeks ago, local partners, CCGs. What the Prime Minister doesn't deserve credit for is the failures that were borne out at the start of this pandemic, which again has cost so many lives.
Tom?
Well, I think if we look at the performance of the government over the last few months, and I think we saw it in the local elections, I was knocking on the doors, as I'm sure you were, and I had constituents who were thankful, and they credited the Prime Minister. Yes, our brilliant local NHS and all the volunteers at the vaccination centres in my constituency, like your constituency.
The NHS, which we don't want to fund and pay properly, Tom. With the
NHS, which has done a great job.
Nurses,
but ultimately,
don't talk over each other.
For the Prime Minister at St Thomas's Hospital in my constituency.
If Keir Starmer was a Prime Minister, I'm pretty sure we would have gone down the EMA route. And that would have meant that we're in a similar position to other European countries at the moment when it comes to vaccination, not the position they're currently in, which is far ahead of them. That has saved lives. It also means we can open our economy sooner. Prime Minister deserves credit for that, as does our NHS. It's not either or. They've both risen up and they've done a great job over the last 3 months. They've both done a good job.
Right. Sarah, in terms of the sort of public-private element, I mean, is it too ideological, do you think, from some of the politicians in how test and trace and how the vaccination programme is working?
Absolutely. I mean, look, I think, again, as an ordinary citizen, we just want it to work. We want everybody to be safe. We want to open up again. We want to be able to travel. We want everything. We want people to open up their businesses. That's what everybody wants. And what we have seen is the politicization of something where lives are literally hanging in the balance. And I think there are an awful lot of people who are really, really frustrated by that, and particularly frustrated by the sense that test and trace just became a cash cow for, people who don't seem to have had the proper clearances. It's not clear that the right processes were followed there. And I think a lot of people are really, really worried about that. And we're seeing that has real consequences. I absolutely think, we all have lots of friends and family in the NHS, and it seems really clear that the success of the vaccine rollout is down to the success of the NHS, which knows how to give jabs. It's been doing that for a long time. They know how to do it. But when the government tried to create this whole new test and trace thing, it didn't work. It has not worked yet. It still isn't working. And now we're just hearing that it might be responsible for yet another major setback.
Right. I mean, Gitto, what are the political implications, do you think, of this report?
Well, in the end, I think test and trace, with all its flaws, was a short-term damage limitation job. The long-term answer to this is the vaccination programme, and it is a triumph of many of the things that are best about Britain. Great universities, fantastic private companies, great organisation. I'm very proud to say I'm a volunteer vaccinator. I jabbed 75 people 2 days ago. And they come in and they're grateful to receive the jab. They leave feeling more positive, and they are, frankly, in awe that the UK has got its act together as well as it has at this scale. So in the end, of course, when you're chasing such huge targets, you're going to drop the odd ball every now and then. But the vaccination programme is, really the envy of the world, and it's the long-term cure. It doesn't forgive mistakes that happen at the moment, but if they're acknowledged, then it's understandable that the odd ball is dropped.
Let's talk about this headline in the Times newspaper today. Senior civil servants as privileged as they were 50 years ago. This is a report out today. It's actually the main finding of a report from government advisers on the Social Mobility Commission, which suggests that hidden rules still favour those with the right accent, while a class ceiling prevents less advantaged staff from reaching senior grades. What's gone wrong, Tom?
Well, I think it's not good. I think we all want to see diversity in our civil service, but when I say diversity, yes, I mean ethnic diversity, gender balance, but also from different class backgrounds, and I think we are seeing more of that. We're seeing certain government departments now being moved to other parts of the country. I think Darlington's getting the Treasury branch. And I think clearly those sorts of decisions to move government departments to other parts of the country, I think, will be positive in terms of helping to combat that. But clearly I want to see a civil service that is as reflective as possible as a country that it's essentially running.
But why so little progress so far?
Well, I think it's very complicated. I think there's a number of reasons potentially to do with the education system over the last few decades, and I think that we need to try and do better. Right.
Sarah, what do you think lies behind the lack of progress over so many decades?
Look, I think that the educational system is where the solution resides, and it's going to be getting that right. Education has historically been proven to be the most successful human system for redistributing privilege. It's the best means that we have, but that doesn't mean that we always get education right. And the barriers to entry for education in this country remain really, really problematic. So the relationship between economics and education is something that still needs to be disentangled. We still need to make sure that students are, that they're getting the educational opportunities that they need. And very clearly, that simply isn't the case for too many students, particularly right now with the pandemic. We all can see the ways in which the educational system is failing students right now. But I do obviously, as an educator, I believe that education is the solution. But what we can see is that it is, again, it has not had the investment it needs. I mean, a lot of this is really simple. It does come down to investment. It does come down to making sure that you actually want to create those kinds of inclusive measures. And, there are a lot of red herrings in the educational system, over the last 10 to 15 years, as I've been watching the way that the school curriculum has developed, the kind of insistence on that we can only tell stories about our past that make us feel good. That doesn't get at any of the serious problems that we face as a society. And that, in my view, is what the educational system needs to be coming to grips with.
You're nodding in agreement, Gitto.
Yes, in the end, nobody wants a surgeon to operate on them because he or she ticks a certain box. You want a surgeon who's qualified as a surgeon. So you don't suddenly want to populate the top levels of the civil service with people who cannot run a massive government department with multi-million pounds sort of budgets doing all kinds of complex things. You've got to put it right in which kind of people go to the kind of universities that then feed into the civil service. Yes, open up the number of universities, find the odd person who may have taken a different path, of which there are fewer than you probably think for that sort of world. But that's where the meritocracy's got to kick in at sort of 18. And before then, to make sure that at 18, not everybody who goes to the top institutions are from that same sort of background.
Right. I mean, Florence, the report identifies how cosy fireside chats conducted in a neutral, received pronunciation accent help those from privileged backgrounds navigate what's called the velvet drainpipe of recruitment. What do you think has been the problem, Florence?
I think part of the problem is that we have to look at what is practically being done to address this. So, for example, I've taken part in a parliamentary speaker scheme to help people who don't normally think about a career in politics apply. So I've taken on a young boy, fantastic gentleman called Harry, suffers from cerebral palsy, is in a wheelchair, and he has just been a great addition to my team. And we need to go beyond recruiting people who look and sound and come from our own circles. And the fact is, just this morning, I went to visit one of my secondary schools in Vauxhall, London Nautical, and speaking to those young people who've missed so much vital education. The truth is, no matter how good our schools are, the reality is that education on its own will not solve this. We need to look at what goes on beyond the classroom. There are so many things that we can do to help those children in terms of those inequalities, which we know sadly still exist. And we need to look at how we can address that. We need to be honest about that. We had a big discussion around race earlier last year. But what more are people doing? It's not just about you turning your Twitter screen black for one day. We really need everyone to commit to this agenda.
Right, and you say it goes beyond the classroom. Do you agree with that, Tom? Because
I actually agree with many of the points that have just been made there. But I do think the government kind of knows that politics and the civil service is a bit of a bubble. It's all in London. I think it could be a really good move to start moving some of the government departments out.
Do you think that would radically change?
Well, not necessarily by itself, no. But I think, quite clearly, if we are going to have big government departments in places like Darlington, we need to make sure that is coupled with a kind of recruitment agenda and an outreach and engagement agenda to try and make it so that we actually do better when it comes to making sure our civil service is more reflective. But I also agree with the point that we want the best people in the jobs, because these are hugely important jobs, running government departments.
And on that, it would help to open up the civil service to people from, dare I say, the private sector, so that you have people who are doing jobs elsewhere who come in not for life, not to climb the greasy pole, but to come in to get something done and then leave again. And if you do that, then you do get people who've gone through the school of hard knocks or the school of running a business, and they can contribute more. But that, again, opens up another can of worms.
Well, which we have seen to some extent. Florence?
The reality is, the findings are not, no offence, the findings are not new. We know all this already. The data already exists. But what we need to see is real action. If the government are really committed to tackling this, they need to, work with people, with institutions who have experience, who have lived experience, and bringing in that diversity of thought, gender, race, all the diversity to help make all our society, not just politics, media, legal, it has to be truly reflexive. And at the moment, that's still not happening because you are finding people recruiting within their own.
Right. I mean, Tom, you're on the Education Select Committee, and the committee is holding an inquiry into left-behind white pupils from disadvantaged backgrounds. What exactly are you looking at?
Well, it's children who are eligible for free school meals across the board, but we're looking at why it is that it seems to be white children who are eligible for free school meals, who, when it comes to some of the academic measurements, GCSE attainment, A-levels, university access, seem to be doing quite a bit worse than other groups who are similarly disadvantaged in a socio-economic perspective. So we've had an inquiry going on for sort of 3 or 4 months. We had our final session yesterday. The report should be published in the next few months. And we have actually, and there's lots of complicated reasons why this may be the case. Some of it to do with culture, some of it to do with the role of religion, family breakdown, perceptions of education, and whether it's perceived as being a platform for advancement, and whether that's different in some communities than others. But it's a pretty complicated situation, but we need to combat it.
Right, but are you saying that most disadvantage lies in class background?
Well, that's one of the things that came through yesterday in a session we had with Tony Sewell, actually. That was his view, and that seems to be what the evidence suggests. Right, what do you think, Florence?
As a black working class girl who got elected to represent the seat that I represent, I know that it isn't about either or, but we do need to look at how we tackle the inequality, which sometimes starts in the classroom. As someone who was on free school meals when I was at school as well, this notion that everything's resolved in London and the streets of London are paved with gold, there's pockets of deprivation. So if the government are really committed to levelling up, it has to mean levelling up right across the country. My worry is that this levelling up agenda is only going to happen in the north.
Right. I mean, Sarah, where do you think the real disadvantage lies if the government is trying to find solutions?
Look, I think that it's not about where the real disadvantage lies, because that's what we call a race to the bottom, right? Who's the worse off, and let's only focus on them. The problem is that we have, as we are identifying, that we have too many people in our society who feel that education is not, and I think Tom's phrase, perception of education, is really, really important here. They perceive education as something that is not for them, particularly higher education. I have literally had people say to me, I'd like to go to university, but it isn't for the likes of me. And, in my view, what we have to get to as a society is a point where nobody ever says that, because nobody feels that. And if they're passionate about learning, as humans are, we're all curious, we all like to learn. The problem is the disconnect between people's individual passion for learning and their sense that school is not serving that passion, and that it's not giving them the skills that they need, and providing them for their own interests, and connecting with them in a way that they find meaningful, in a way that lets them develop in the way that they want to do. That's not easy. There's no one quick solution that I can glibly toss out there. But again, it actually takes investment in education. It takes thinking about this. And I absolutely agree with Florence, it takes trusting local communities, understanding that they know what their students need, and working with those communities so that those students are not left behind, and so that they really believe that education is for them. It's for everyone, and that they can find their path through it.
Right, Tom?
I think it's important it's not just about university. I actually think perhaps in the past decade there's been a bit too much focus on university. I think from an early age there needs to be a sense that there's multiple pathways. Yes, there's an academic pathway, and if you want to do that, we're going to believe in you, we're going to back you. But there's also another pathway, potentially technical apprenticeships. Multiple pathways, and from an early age that needs to be made really clear to young people.
All right, well, let's stick with education. Remember these protests from last summer? We're showing pictures of them at Oxford University, calling for the statue of the 19th century imperialist Cecil Rhodes outside Oriel College to come down. It was in the wake of another statue being torn down. This time it was the industrialist and slave trader Edward Colston in Bristol. And this story today, which is looking at what a commission that was set up to do, which actually backed the decision by Oriel College to take down the statue of Cecil Rhodes, has put out this statement. The Commission backed the college's original wish to remove the statue, whilst acknowledging the complex challenges and costs presented by its removal in terms of heritage and planning consent, particularly since the government's policy in relation to historic statues and sites which have become contested is to retain and explain them. So, on balance, the decision has been taken that it should remain. Tom, Oriel College wants the statue to come down. This independent commission agrees and backs that decision. Why should government stand in the way?
Well, because this is an independent commission that the college put together, and actually I know one of the members on it, I think, embraced the Colston statue being illegally taken down. So I don't necessarily think this commission is beyond question.
But they do back the original decision by Oriel College to bring it down. It's only because, as they say, the cost implications and the fact that it will have to go through the government and the Secretary of State, Robert Jenrick, who says retain and explain. But why should it?
I think the vast majority of people in our country do not want to see statue toppling. They do not want to see us going around ransacking our past. Ultimately, this particular Cecil Rhodes was a man of his time, And I think we could, by all means, let's have a debate about him, the man, his, his links to unsavoury aspects of our past. But ultimately, what we can agree is that he was a key figure for that college. And I just don't know what it achieves by toppling his statue. I don't know how it brings people together. I don't know I don't know what it achieves.
Florence?
I think this goes back to some of the things I mentioned around education. What I would like to see is a real discussion about some of the maybe difficult parts of British history which we don't want to discuss. You know, young people learning, apologies, bells are in the background.
That's
young
all right,
people learning about that. Young people learning about that in school and addressing that and knowing what happened in the past, as opposed to trying to brush it under the carpet, this, polite British way that we sometimes want to do.
Right, so you're not in favour of the statue coming down,
That's
then?
what I want to do. The Commission has reported back, and I think it's a shame that essentially they want to, but they're being told not to. And I think, again, we do need to get the fact that the statue is still controversial. I think if there are other commissions that are set up, they have to be fully independent so that when they reach a conclusion, the government then don't come in at the last minute.
Right, so you do think it should come down?
This is for the Commission to decide.
Right. Gitto, what's your view?
Some of us were told stories when we were kids about people who did bad and then wanted to make it right. And Cecil Rhodes clearly made his money in ways which were the product of his age, which we now frown upon, rightly and understandably. But while I happened to be at that university, from a state school in South Wales, most of my friends who were Rhodes Scholars, in fact, every single one of them was non-white. It was the best scholarship for getting a particularly good friend of mine of Mexican origin in there, people from African countries. There was a huge legacy, and the Rhodes Scholarship was associated with the most massive, significant boost to ethnic diversity in Oxford in the 80s. So that is something that produced a lot of good from something that was initially bad. And we've got to remember the rough with the smooth these days and not just go trashing one side of it because we're not interested in learning about the whole picture.
Sarah, should the statue come down?
Yeah, I think it should. I think it should then go into a museum, right? It's not about, we're not talking about toppling it or destroying it or pulling it down in anger as the Colston statue was. When we use statues and when we name buildings for people, we're doing that to honor them. That's not really history. We don't put up statues for history. We write books for history. We make films for history. We tell stories about history. Statues are not very good history. They're pretty silent if what we actually want is history. And if what we want is to understand the good with the bad, as everybody is saying, statues don't get that job done. The question is, do we want to honor these people or not? Okay. And in my view, as a society, we no longer want to honor Cecil Rhodes. So we say, once we did, now we don't. We're in a moment where the government just agreed to that the 450-year-old Whitechapel Bell Foundry can be turned into a boutique hotel, right? So when it comes to there anymore. We're not actually talking about
all right. Well, let Tom
erasing history. We're talking about what we choose to honor and what we choose to glorify and what we don't. And also to the point about Rhodes Scholarship, Cecil Rhodes set up Rhodes Scholarships because he explicitly wanted America and Britain to come back together for white supremacism. That's why he set up Rhodes Scholarship, so that white Americans would come over and so that white supremacism could happen.
So let Tom respond.
Okay. Glad I got in there. I honestly do. I don't see statues as necessarily about honouring someone. I think it's about saying that this individual was a significant person, they were part of this country's history. I mean, where does it stop? That's the question. I'm quarter Irish and I'm a sort of lapsed Roman Catholic. What about the Cromwell statue near Parliament? Do we take that way? No. I don't see the Cromwell statue being there as honouring Oliver Cromwell. I mean, he was a man who people have very, very different opinions, who did really bad stuff in Ireland. But I think that statue should stay because it's part of our history. It's not about saying we love Oliver Cromwell, he was beyond question. He is a part of a rich tapestry of his country's history, and that statue should stay. Ultimately, if we want to get rid of the Cecil Rhodes statue, then we're probably going to have to get rid of a load of other statues. And we've seen with Mayor Khan's commission and review, which is a board largely populated with people of exactly the same mind, where this sort of stuff can go. But ultimately, we're a country with a mixed past. On the whole, we're a great country. And actually, America's a great country as well. You should be proud of it.
Sarah?
I'm proud of it. There's nothing to do with not being proud of my country. The point is that the point is that as everybody has been saying, we can talk about the good and the bad, but we can make decisions about who we choose to honor. And I don't agree with you that that's not what statues are for. I think they are. I would still say that I find it remarkable that people want to have this huge argument about the statue of a person who did a lot of bad things while we're talking about a government that has just sold off a huge historic monument that's 450 years old. That statue is actually a fairly recent statue as well. It's not even that historic. Yes, he was an important individual. Nobody's saying we shouldn't, I'm not saying we erase him from the history books. We talk about his role in history. We talk about the good and the bad. We talk about all of the complexity. That's exactly what all historians want to do. But in terms of thinking about the historical infrastructure of our society and what's the built commemorations within it, as I say, to me, it's much more horrifying that we're removing the Whitechapel Bell Foundry. Nobody wants to talk about that. Everybody wants to talk about a stupid statue of Cecil Rhodes.
Tom?
I don't think we're a nation of statue topplers, and I do agree. I think Mayor Khan should get on with tackling crime, building affordable housing, not messing around with a ridiculous. It's interesting he's got this column now in Yorkshire Post, and he's saying we need less culture wars and less division when he's doing more than any senior politician in the country to promote it.
Sarah, a question to you, because you heard Florence say that actually we should abide by the decision of the Commission and therefore leave the statue where it is. Is that strong enough in your mind from Labour?
Look, I think I believe in abiding by commissions as well. I mean, you asked me my personal opinion. If it were down to me, I would
absolutely
remove it and put it in a museum. Is it strong enough? Yeah, I think it is, because as I say, I think to a certain extent this whole thing is a bit of a red herring, insofar as it's turned into this, language of statue toppling, which is, meant to be inflammatory, when what a lot of people are just trying to do is to have a more complex conversation about our past. And what the debates about the Cecil Rhodes statue have done has enabled that more complex conversation. It has actually moved the needle pretty significantly, where when it was first suggested, it was absolutely unheard of and nobody would even admit that it was, something that we could consider. And now people are taking that possibility seriously and approaching all of this more thoughtfully, which to my view is really the goal, whether an individual statue stands on a building or doesn't stand on a building.
All right. Florence, I just want you to respond to something that Tom said, which is about the board or the commission that's been set up by the London Mayor Sadiq Khan to look at these sorts of subjects. Do you think it was fair that Tom claims it's been stacked with people all of the same mind?
I think that's a mischaracterisation of the people on there. All of them applied for that position. They were selected, and they're reviewing the commission is set up by the mayor and the deputy mayor for culture. But we need to look at the fact that those conversations need to be had, and we need to be open about those conversations. But toppling down a statute is not going to address the inequalities and injustice that we are still seeing to a number of black and minority ethnic people in this country. That's what we should be talking about. And no toppling of statute or additional reviews that the government want to keep doing. The data is there. It's glaringly obvious. And we need action from the government in addressing that.
All right, well, let's stick with Labour and show everybody this headline in The Guardian. It's actually a story from last week. It says Rachel Reeves, the new Shadow Chancellor, is to consult Joe Biden's team on Labour's economic offer. Shadow Chancellor will discuss how party can appeal to blue-collar voters and urban graduates. Now, Labour's had quite a bruising time recently following the election results. Florence, what lessons, if any, do you think Labour can learn from President Biden?
It's refreshing to see President Biden win. I still have fond memories of being in Ohio in 2008, campaigning for the then Barack Obama. And I think what the Biden administration has brought to American politics is just putting aside that divisive Trump era. And we are seeing America cooperating with the international community more, addressing some of the social injustices that's been happening. And, we're seeing things like return to the Paris Climate Agreement, for example. And what I think Labour can definitely learn from America is around building that unity, bringing people together and addressing the key issues facing the country. And that, those are the key lessons that I would want Labour to be looking at in making sure we are election ready.
Right. I mean, Sarah, do you think Keir Starmer can learn from specific policies from Joe Biden, or is it more a case of how he presents himself?
I think it's more about how he presents himself, actually. I mean, I think there are policy lessons to be learned, to be sure. And I think that that progressive coalition that Biden has surprised a lot of people by building is clearly working so far. I mean, he has skyrocketing approval ratings, not just among the Democrats, across the country. So he's clearly getting it right, at least right now. And so obviously there's always stuff to learn from somebody who's getting it right to that degree. But the fact of the matter is that everybody in America knows who Uncle Joe is. He's Uncle Joe. He's been on the scene for 50 years. He was the vice president. As Florence said, he gained an awful lot of social credit, as it were, for supporting Obama the way that he did, so unquestionably, and for wanting to work to support the first Black president. So, you know, I think that Starmer is suffering from a kind of lack of identity in a public sense. Right. People don't know what his public identity is. And and particularly to go against somebody like Boris Johnson, he's going to have to start to put across that personality.
OK, Gitto.
I think it's refreshing that you can be pale, male, stale, as the term goes, and be regarded as a progressive who's good for the world. That's refreshing. He did, of course, have an opponent who was a disgrace to democracy across the world. That is not the case here. Whatever you think of Boris Johnson, he's not Donald Trump. He's not somebody who's dragging the office of state through the mud. And therefore, it was a pretty low bar to appear more statesmanlike, to appear more unifying, to appear more civilized than his opponent. I think he's done a great job. But Keir Starmer has a higher bar to reach. And the start there, I think there is a clue. He needs to be a little more gritty, a little more real. We need to smell the guy. We need to find out what he believes in, not have him sort of posing in front of wallpaper at John Lewis, when there's so many more important things for the UK to be wrestling with.
Florence?
I agree with Gitto in terms of the low bar with Donald Trump, but unfortunately, having sat in the chamber, I haven't had the opportunity to do a lot of that as a new MP because of the lockdown. It's painful sometimes to watch a prime minister, because I do feel that some of that divisiveness, and in essence, straight from the Trump playbook, where you have the prime minister, again, as a new MP, still trying to learn some of the rules and regulations and standing orders, but, misinformation and being called out on that, not retracting that is not what we want to see in leadership. And what Joe Biden's leadership is showing, that you can be a unifier, you can be honest, you can be a decent person, which are all the qualities that Keir has.
All right.
And, I'm looking forward to getting Keir out and about in my constituency right across the country so that people can see that as well.
Tom?
I think the Democratic Party, stumbled across probably in some senses the ideal candidate. I think that Joe Biden, connected in the Rust Belt in a way which Hillary Clinton wasn't able to do, and I think, but that doesn't hide the fact that actually the Democratic Party in America, I think, have got some serious problems. And I think when Joe Biden leaves, I think we might see that he hasn't really changed the Democratic Party. I think you've got the average Joe who's formed in the minds of most American voters over decades. But I think ultimately they could be back at square one in, 4 or 8 years' time.
All right. Well, Florence, there's another electoral challenge coming along very soon, and that's the by-election in Batley and Spen. Nominations to be Labour candidate closed today at 5 o'clock. Let's just show everybody this article by Diane Abbott, senior Labour figure. Losing by-election would be curtains for Keir Starmer, says Diane Abbott. What do you think about what she's said and written, Florence? Do you agree?
I'm hoping that a number of our Labour MPs, including myself as a London MP, will all be out once a candidate's selected, to help that candidate so that we can retain that seat.
Sure, but
and build on
Labour
the
loses
it, of Tracy Brabin.
If Labour loses it, it's not just Diane Abbott actually. Richard Bergen, another Labour MP on the left, implied the same, that if Labour don't win it, then Keir Starmer will be out.
I don't think this is about whether or not if Labour wins it, should Keir be out. The focus has to be on getting the right candidate for that by-election and getting people to come out and engage and vote.
Right. Well, Diane Abbott also thinks Andy Burnham, the mayor of Greater Manchester, would be more suitable as leader. He's the man. Do you agree?
There isn't a vacancy at the moment, unfortunately.
So why has he got a column in the Evening Standard? And Sadiq Khan's, you're all over Yorkshire
They're going to do a job swap.
Everyone can do a column. You could put a column in as well, Tom.
But isn't it remarkable? Isn't it remarkable?
Andy's got a fantastic job that he's doing. Sadiq's got.
Isn't it remarkable though? We're talking about the government of the day making multiple gains in parliamentary by-elections.
All right, and on that, I'm afraid we have to stop it there. But thank you to all of you for a fascinating discussion on this programme. I'll be back on Monday at 12:15. Bye bye.